So, good morning, Professor. Good morning, everyone. My name is Natasha, and I'm a professor at the Federal University of Jataí in Brazil, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to welcome Professor Mirosława Buchholtz to the third conference on Henry James and the first symposium on the study of realism and modernism. These events are organized by the Henry James Research Center, which is Brazil's first and only research group dedicated to the study of Henry James. We would like to express our thanks to the department and graduate program in literary theory and comparative literature at the University of São Paulo, and the Brazilian Coordination for the Improvement of Higher Education Personnel, CAPES, and the Laboratory for the Study of the Novel for their generous support. Our distinguished speaker today, Professor Mirosława Buchholtz, earned her MA in English Philology from the Jagiellonian University and completed her PhD in English and American Literature at the Brandeis University in the United States. She later received her postdoctoral degree from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń, where she has been teaching since 2000. Her research focuses on 19th and 20th century Canadian and American literature, with a special emphasis on the work of Henry James. Her interests also include autobiographical and travel writing, literary translation, reception studies, film adaptations, and North American literary fairy tales. She has been the recipient of numerous prestigious fellowships and grants and is actively involved in several international academic associations, including the European Society of Jamesian Studies and the Henry James Society, which she led as a president in 2017. She currently serves as a book review editor for the Henry James Review. So please join me in welcoming Professor Buchholtz.
Thank you so much, Professor Costa. It's such a lovely introduction and such a lovely invitation. I feel really honored, and it's just wonderful to meet, at least at a distance, my colleagues in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, which my grandfather visited many years ago. He didn't stay, but he visited Sao Paulo. So there is a soft spot for Sao Paulo here. Thank you. Thanks very much. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and Professor Costa kindly agreed to change slides. Now, I'll begin with an introduction, with setting the scene for what I'm going to focus on today. Now, most of us today, would you please turn to slide 2? Next slide, please. Most of us today remember Henry James as the author of groundbreaking novels such as The Portrait of a Lady and The Ambassadors. These works are represented in numerous editions, a few of which are displayed on this slide. There is, however, some ambiguity surrounding the classification of James's fiction. Stories like Daisy Miller and The Turn of the Screw are typically considered novellas or tales, yet they are sometimes included in collections labeled as novels, as you can see on this slide. The cover on the right illustrates an edition of James's early fiction predating The Portrait of a Lady. In total, James published around 20 novels, and I'm not including unfinished or collaborative works, and also approximately 112 short stories or tales, as he called them. Shown here, next slide, please. Shown here is the complete Tales of Henry James, a 12-volume edition published by his biographer, Leon Edel, between 1962 and 1964. The first tale in this collection, in volume 1, A Tragedy of Error, appeared anonymously in 1864, when James was just 21. More recently, next slide, please, the Cambridge edition of The Complete Fiction of Henry James has undertaken a comprehensive scholarly edition publication of James's works. So far, it includes 2 volumes of his tales. Interestingly, the general editors have expressed some doubt as to whether A Tragedy of Error should be considered James's true debut. During Henry James Society conferences, where this ongoing editorial project is enthusiastically followed, questions occasionally arise about the possibility of an earlier publication. Such inquiries are especially relevant given that the Cambridge edition of The Complete Fiction of Henry James prioritizes the original publications, in contrast to the New York edition, which included James's final revisions and literary legacy. In 2004, Floyd R. Horowitz published a controversial collection of 20 tales that he claimed James may have written between 1852, when he was 9, and 1863, when he was 20. And that's the cover on the right. Something got wrong with the dates. The book to the right was published in 2004. The Jolly Corner in 2017. So in this collection, Horowitz was drawing on stylistic analysis, and he attributed anonymous magazine stories to the young Henry James. However, the scholarly community has largely remained unconvinced. Still, the possibility that James began publishing fiction prior to 1864 continues to intrigue and challenge Jamesians. The mystery surrounding James's juvenilia is compounded by his own efforts to obscure his early work. Would you please turn to slide 5? His father, Henry James Sr., wrote to his mother, the boy's grandmother, and that was a letter written in 1857 and sent from Boulogne in France. And the father wrote, "Harry is not so fond of study, properly so called, as of reading. He is a devourer of libraries and an immense writer of novels and dramas. He has considerable talent as a writer." End of quote. And at just 14, James was already recognized by his father as a voracious and at the same time discerning reader, and apparently a prolific, if self-critical, writer. No manuscripts from this period have survived the family's many relocations, which is sad, or perhaps not at all. In the letter to James's grandmother, the father mentions the boy's dramatic compositions, though James would later struggle to find success on the stage. Indeed, James's foray into drama during the 1890s was an ambitious but ultimately frustrating chapter in his career. Slide 6, please. His theatrical efforts, aimed at rivaling audience favorites like Oscar Wilde, did not meet with lasting acclaim. Next slide, please. This rivalry was later fictionalized by Colm Tóibín in The Master, published in 2004, and David Lodge in Author, also published in 2004, half a year later than Tóibín's book. While James may have lost the theatrical battle to Wilde, he gained valuable insight into dramatic structure and dialogue that would enhance his own fiction. Incidentally, Lodge's novel also lost literary spotlight to Tóibín's. Beyond fiction and drama, next slide, please. Beyond fiction and drama, James was a prolific writer of travel literature. Next slide, please. Biography and autobiography. And next slide, please. And literary criticism. His 1879 monograph on Nathaniel Hawthorne, which we saw in previous slide, cover of which we saw in the previous slide. This monograph exemplifies his tendency to blend biography with literary evaluation, which was the standard procedure back then, even though James was leaning toward the latter, toward literary criticism. He said he didn't have that much to say about biography proper. He would focus on the books and literature. Over more than 50 years of literary activity, James authored some 300 theoretical and critical essays, reviews, and prefaces. These writings explore the art of fiction and engage with the work of American and European, especially English and French authors. His essays on the visual and performing arts form a separate, significant body of work. Today, I would like to focus on James's evolution as a reviewer, from his early reviews to his later authoritative theorizing of the novel. In this discussion, I will draw on a recent book, Henry James on Writers and Writing. Next slide, and then, yes, and next then. One more. Thank you. These are the books I'll be referring to. First of all, Henry James on Writers and Writing, on the right, which was edited by Michael Gora and published this year, 2025. And then Views and Reviews on the left, which was compiled by Leroy Phillips and published during James's lifetime in 1908. And then in the middle, there's the first edition of Morton Doan Zabel's Literary Opinion in America, which was first published in 1937. I will also refer to two major ongoing editorial projects. I've already mentioned them, I think one of them. Next slide, please. The complete letters of Henry James, published by the University of Nebraska Press. And next slide, please. The complete fiction of Henry James, published by Cambridge University Press. These are only a few titles of quite a number already. Now, before he became a towering figure in Anglo-American literature and a pioneering theorist of the novel, James launched his career with more modest contributions: travel sketches, short fiction, and literary reviews. In the introduction to his new edition of James's literary criticism, Michael Gora, by the way, he's also the author of the famous Portrait of a Novel, published in 2012. But in this recent book, published this year, a collection of James's literary criticism, Michael Gora captures the boldness of Henry James's early criticism. Next slide, please. Here is the opening chapter, the opening sentences of Gora's introduction. Please look at the first sentence, only 4 words. The nerve he had. 22 years old and living with his parents in Cambridge, a law school dropout with just 2 pieces of published fiction to his name. This boy sets out in the fall of 1865 to take down the most famous novelist of the day, and pretty nearly succeeds. Our mutual friend, the young Henry James suggested, stands as the poorest of Charles Dickens' novels, and poor with the poverty not of momentary embarrassment, but of permanent exhaustion. There's a quotation within quotation. Weak, depressing, unprofitable, insufficient, mechanical, superficial, gratuitous, cheap, lifeless. Those are the adjectives James used in writing for a new weekly called The Nation. And once you've read that list, you can't forget it. This is the end of this quotation from Gora's introduction. This early review not only reflects James's critical confidence, but also marks the beginning of his long engagement with the novel as a serious art form, one that he would both practice and theorize in the decades to come. The 1865 review of Our Mutual Friend, in which the young Henry James critiqued Dickens, is just one example of what Michael Gora calls James's sharply critical early essays. James was, Gora observes, and I'm quoting, funny and quotable, uncowed by reputation. Now, at this point, James had not yet found his own voice as a novelist, but, as Gora astutely notes, quote, he wrote about what his predecessors got wrong in the hopes that he might someday get it right, end of quote. In other words, reviewing served not only as literary criticism, but also as a form of self-education. James was right to take on the best, commenting on, indeed finding fault with, authors such as Dickens and George Eliot was a form of literary apprenticeship. His earliest published review, according to Gora, was an 1864 critique of a collection of essays by Nassau W. Sr. Gora described Sr. as an English lawyer, but that may be incorrect. The editors of the Complete Letters of Henry James identify Sr. as a British economist and author of political articles, biographical sketches, and critical essays. James's unsigned review of essays on fiction by Sr. appeared in the North American Review, the oldest literary magazine in the United States, founded in Boston in 1815 and now available, thankfully, through Heavy Trust. Gora notes that James was paid, quote unquote, $12 for a few opinionated pages, roughly $244 today. Over the next 12 years, James would publish hundreds of short pieces, including travel sketches and critical essays. As Gora puts it, James reviewed everything, a few thousand words at a time. Senior's book was published in 1864. Yes, and we can actually switch to the next slide, please. The book by Seniors, the book under review, was published in early 1864. The Essays on Fiction review, 8 pages long, was submitted by James in July 1864 and published in October the same year. Now, this quick turnaround, barely several months, suggests that James read, wrote, and published rapidly. That said, it appears that he didn't read the entire book. Senior's volume comprises over 500 pages, and James's review focuses only on a few of the early chapters. He is forthright and at times dismissive, more sophomore than scholar, but already writing with confidence. Though anonymous, we know it is his review because of a cover letter he sent to the editors, and this letter was transcribed in the Complete Letter. So here's a quotation. Let me just read it out loud. July 30th, 1864, to the editors of the North American Review. Gentlemen, I take the liberty of enclosing a brief review of Senior's Essays on Fiction, published in London a few months ago, hoping that you may deem it worthy of a place among your literary notices. I remain yours respectfully, Henry James, Jr. The review's tone is, next slide, please. The review's tone, and you have, the first and last page of this review, 8 pages in all. The review's tone is evaluative and confident, though structurally it is incomplete. It does not engage the entire volume. Still, it shows remarkable maturity for a first-time author. Could someone truly write 8 pages of print-worthy prose without any previous writing and publishing experience? Possibly not. One must remember, however, that letter writing in the 19th century was a serious literary practice. James was a prolific correspondent, and his upbringing immersed him in literary discussion. His father, Henry James Sr., also occasionally wrote reviews and served as an early model for his son's intellectual engagement. As scholars continue to examine James's early work, The question of what constitutes his first publication remains open. Next slide, please. Gora claims the 1864 review is James's debut, but the editors of the complete letters offer a more cautious timeline. They write the date of January 6, 1863, and the following comment: what may be his first known publication, an unsigned review of Maggie Mitchell's performance in Fanchon the Cricket, appears in the Daily Traveler, a Boston newspaper. Right. So, which please switch to next slide. Next slide, please. Right. So here we have Maggie Mitchell as Fanchon in a play, Fanchon the Cricket, adapted from the story novella by George Sand, who was one of James's favorite authors at that time, the authors he read. So there is a literary precedent to that performance. James's early reviews, often anonymous, have been identified through letters, editorial records, and publisher account books. These initial efforts were often sharply critical. In his 20s, James seemed to have needed to push against the great figures of his time, perhaps to clarify his own literary aims. Next slide, please. By the mid-1870s, however, his tone begins to shift. In 1874, during an extended trip to Europe, James picked up a German translation of Ivan Turgenev's stories in a spa town. Reading in German, quite a challenge, because it was printed in Fraktur, in this Gothic style. And then he was reading Turgenev in French, because little of Turgenev had yet been translated into English. James was captivated. His long essay on Turgenev, published in the North American Review in April 1874. Next slide, please. All right, here we have an excerpt from Turgenev's text in German, and then on the right, the translation of the same excerpt into English. And next slide, please. So here it is, James's essay on Turgenev, published in the North American Review in April 1874, which runs to 31 pages. And it is signed, as you can see, because I pasted here page one, the first page of the review, and the last one. And it is signed. Unlike his earlier reviews, this essay is appreciative, in addition to being contextual and interpretive. James compares Turgenev to Dickens, and yes, you have guessed, he finds Turgenev superior. The contrast between James's 1864 review of Senior's book, which he disparaged, and the 1874 essay on Turgenev, whom he discovered and admired, reveals much about James's evolution as a reader and critic. A decade of writing brought with it increased depth, nuance, and an openness to praise. It also brought formal changes, a longer format, a visible authorial signature, and a greater commitment to aesthetic appreciation. James met Turgenev in Paris in 1875 and was introduced by him to a circle of French writers that included Gustave Flaubert, Émile Zola, and Guy de Maupassant. These encounters had what Gora calls, quote unquote, a decisive effect on James's fiction and his criticism alike. By the end of the 1870s, James stopped reviewing individual books. Gora laments this shift, expressing his wish to know what James would have thought about specific books published in his lifetime. Instead, James turned to essays to writing essays about authors, many of whom he discussed repeatedly. He wrote 5 essays on Turgenev, 5 on Alphonse Daudet, 4 on Zola, and 3 on Flaubert. These essays often serve as both literary portraits and self-portraits. As Gora remarks, no one can read his 1907 account of the Tempest and not think of James's own late style. Among James's finest essay is The Lesson of Balzac, delivered as part of a lecture tour in the United States in 1904-1905. It's also included in Gora's anthology. Nearly 50 of James's critical essays were collected during his lifetime in 4 volumes. French Poets and Novelists, published in 1878, Partial Portraits, published in 1888, Essays in London and Elsewhere, 1893, and Notes on Novelists, 1914. In 1879, James published a book-length study of Nathaniel Hawthorne. John Morley, a writer and politician, invited James to contribute to a series of literary biographies. Hawthorne was the only American subject in the series, and for James, now living in England, this was both an honor and a challenge. Hawthorne was his literary forebear, and writing about him was a way to pay tribute, but also to define a distinct literary identity. James's Hawthorne is the only extended critical biography he wrote. It's just under 200 pages. It is modest by modern standards. James begins by justifying its form, a critical essay, not a comprehensive biography. He attributes this decision to the lack of eventfulness in Hawthorne's life. It was, he argues, quiet, provincial, undramatic. James opens with a list of what Hawthorne lacked. He followed no literary method or theory. He was neither a realist nor a historian, and his writing style shows that he was not aware of differences in dialects. His dialogue, James argues, is too refined to be realistic. Still, James acknowledges Hawthorne's psychological insight and his ability to capture the spirit of New England. He appreciates the ambition of Hawthorne's historical fiction even as he critiques it. His tales, James argues, are charming, but ultimately lacking in formal rigor. James dismisses their allegorical structure as trivial and dated, but he admires their psychological depth. The Scarlet Letter, James claims, is marred by excessive symbolism and mechanical repetition. In short, James's critical writing, whether brief, anonymous reviews or lengthy signed essays, charts his intellectual development. It reveals not just his evolving views of literature, but his formation as a literary artist. He began with judgment, he arrived at interpretation. The final paragraph of James's book on Hawthorne reads almost like an obituary. In it, James pays tribute to what he calls, quote unquote, a beautiful, natural, original genius, identifying Hawthorne's central theme as, quote unquote, man's conscience. He concludes that Hawthorne's life, and I'm quoting, had been as pure, as simple, as unsophisticated as his work. This critical biography thus becomes more than a literary study. It serves as a reflection on James's own evolving artistic identity. In examining his predecessor, James was also defining himself, by contrast, as much as by affiliation. The book is best understood alongside the Europeans, published a year earlier, in which James approaches New England life with humor, subtle irony, and an eye for cultural nuance. Taken together, these two works suggest that James's vision of American literature was both admiring and critical, grounded in tradition but pushing towards something more cosmopolitan. Also in 1878, James published French Poets and Novelists, a collection of essays that further reveals his ambivalence toward 19th century American literary achievements. His notorious critique of American provincialism, paired with lists of cultural inadequacies, offended many readers. For James, the only compensating quality in American life seemed to be its sense of humor, a view that provoked strong reactions. Although similar criticism had been voiced earlier by writers like James Fenimore Cooper and Hawthorne himself, they caused particular outrage when expressed by someone still considered young and American. Even William Dean Howells, James's close friend and champion, reacted with frustration. His review of Hawthorne includes several pointed remarks. In response, James wrote him a partly conciliatory letter admitting some excesses while standing by the substance of his claims. In a letter to Charles Eliot Norton, James expressed surprise and no small amount of resentment at the backlash that his book had provoked. He felt misunderstood, dismissed, not by serious readers, but, as he put it, by quote unquote, a brood of prairie hens. The criticism from family members was even harder to bear. His mother lamented the boldness of his attack on America, while his brother William openly disparaged the book. In contrast, the reception in London was much more favorable. By this point, James had transitioned from critic to object of criticism, not only as a novelist, but also as a literary commentator. His personal letters reveal how deeply he felt the sting of this reaction. They also show that even a writer as confident as James could be shaken by public judgment. A new chapter in his critical career began in the early 1880s. In 1882, James suffered the loss of both parents, his mother in January and his father in December. That same year also marked the passing of several literary giants, Flaubert, George Eliot, Emerson, Trollope, and Turgenev. Whether asked or compelled by grief, James responded with a series of memorial essays. As Michael Gora puts it, I quote, over time he became an expert undertaker, fixing the terms and sealing the vault of one reputation after another. End quote. These pieces were neither panegyrics nor pious tributes. James always retained a clear critical eye. As Gora notes, even his obituary essays, quote unquote, don't speak with any special reverence. The passing of his mentors and peers sent a powerful message. The generation by which he had measured himself was gone. At 40, James found himself standing alone, no longer the apprentice, but the standard bearer. It was in this moment that James was prompted to articulate his own artistic principles. The provocation came in 1884 when Walter Besant delivered a lecture titled The Art of Fiction. Though tame, even by the standards of the day, Besant's lecture became the catalyst for James's far more ambitious response, published later that year under the same title. As Gora notes, Besant's lecture would likely be forgotten today if James hadn't taken it as the occasion for the playfully magisterial essay that followed. On the surface, James's The Art of Fiction appears to be a critical review of Besant's ideas. In truth, it is something much more. It is a manifesto. Though he never names them, James enters a coded dialogue with contemporaries such as William Dean Howells, who had claimed that James's fiction surpassed that of Dickens and Thackeray, and Margaret Oliphant, who leapt to defend British literature. As Gora puts it, the essay is, I quote, an elaborate series of coded references in jokes accessible only to those who sit at a groaning board of the period's magazines, end of quote. James was also reacting more broadly to prudishness in literary criticism, One more target in his essay, famous essay, The Art of Fiction, was James Fitzjames Stephen, who in 1857 had condemned Flaubert's Madame Bovary as repellent. Against this backdrop, The Art of Fiction stands as a defense of artistic freedom and seriousness in the novel form. Gora captures the tone of this essay beautifully, comparing this piece to, quote unquote, a buoyant Mozart serenade. What starts as a literary review becomes a defining statement, a pivot from critique to creation. James would return to these themes in his 1899 essay, The Future of the Novel, where he addresses the place of morality, modesty, and especially the condition of women in modern fiction. Here, too, his tone is speculative rather than prescriptive. He acknowledges the artistic courage of writers like Zola and Maupassant, though he remains troubled by their fixation on, quote unquote, the carnal side of man. Notably, James's stance had evolved. Where he had once denounced Zola's brutal indecency in 1876, he later defended the writer's lack of timidity. In these later years, James's art of the review morphed into something more introspective. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the prefaces to the New York edition of his works written between 1905 and 1907. These texts defy easy classification. Are they critical essays, autobiographies, apologias, or artistic summations? Perhaps they are all of the above. James not only commented on his own fiction, he also revised it, sometimes radically. One notable omission was the Bostonians, not because it was inferior, but because he believed it would require complete rewriting. The New York edition aimed to canonize Henry James, but the result was a commercial failure. For James, this was a painful confirmation that there was little popular demand for his art. Next slide, please. Right. While James was immersed in this project, the writing of the prefaces and revising his fiction for the New York edition, Leroy Phillips, who was a cousin of James's friend, William Morton Fullerton, published Views and Reviews. The book was published in 1908. The volume gathered early critical pieces from some of the wide array of periodicals in which James published his reviews, including the North American Review, The Nation. These were works, the pieces collected by Phillips were works that James had not included in his own essay collections. Phillips's introduction makes his goal clear. His aim was to rekindle interest in James by highlighting his early style that readers had once embraced. 2 years earlier, in 1906, Phillips had published the first comprehensive bibliography of James's work. But when he contacted James and asked him for assistance, the response was tepid. In a letter dated September 8, 1904, James confessed that there were many early works he would rather, quote unquote, forget and keep buried. Phillips was not discouraged, and with or without the author's help, he published the first bibliography of James's works, and then also that collection of James's reviews and early review essays. Next slide, please. In 1937, more than 2 decades after Henry James's death, Morton Doan Szabo offered a markedly different reassessment of his work. In the introduction to his 2-volume anthology of American literary criticism, Szabo described James as, and I quote, perhaps the first American man of letters to follow a complete course of literary and critical education, to compare European writers and doctrines, to impose on his own craft and conscious and unprejudiced critical detachment. End of quote. Zabel omitted James's early reviews, selecting instead 3 essays published between 1889 and 1898. I hope you can see them. Criticism, the question of the opportunities, and the great form. These are the 3 pieces by James Zabel includes in his anthology. And actually, the whole anthology begins with Henry James and these 3 texts. Very short texts, very short excerpts. It's like 4 pages, 2 pages at best. Let me just discuss them very briefly. In 1889, James was invited to contribute to a summer school on the novel held in Deerfield, Massachusetts. He did not participate, but he sent a short letter. This letter was later discovered by Leon Edel, and it was first published in 1939. This letter concisely reiterates the principles outlined by James in The Art of Fiction. James summarizes his advice to the summer school participants in 2 little words. Quote, "One is life and the other freedom." End of quote. So this is Henry James providing a précis, a synopsis of his own major essay on literary criticism. Now, in the essay, The Question of Opportunities, which was published in 1898, James reflects on the prospects for American literature. Noting the nation's expanding readership and book market, he observes that, and I quote, "both as readers and as writers on the other side of the Atlantic, women have, in fine, arrived in numbers not equaled even in England." Right? So he makes a comment on American book market and the position of women in that setting. Although the piece includes occasional evaluative remarks, such as on Owen Wister, it is less a review than a meditation on the directions American literature might take. For example, James encourages American authors to explore the figure of the businessman, whose story, he writes, and I quote, "has still to be sung and his picture still to be painted." End of quote. The first essay in Zabel's anthology is Criticism, which was originally published in the New Review in 1891 under the title The Science of Criticism. In it, James critiques the rough and ready reviewing that, as he puts it, flows through the periodical press like a river that has burst its dikes. James holds up French criticism as a model, more selective and restrained, yet ultimately more rigorous and refined. And I'm quoting from James, when French criticism, when it does set itself in motion, James writes, it goes further than with us. It handles the subject in general with finer fingertips. End of quote. In contrast to Zabel's selective portrayal, Michael Gora's recent anthology restores the full range of James's critical output over 50 years of literary activity and critical activity as well. Gora emphasizes the breadth of James's work, from short reviews to extended essays, obituaries, and theoretical reflections. As he writes, and this is a quotation, none of them stands as a panegyric. James was at once generous and strict, and invariably tells us where he thinks his favorites go wrong. And Gora adds, most of the time he's right. Next slide, please. James remained a discerning reader and critic until the end of his life. In the year of his death, he wrote the preface to Rupert Brooks' Letters from America, paying tribute to the young poet and fallen soldier of the First World War. This final gesture of literary advocacy reflects James's enduring dedication to thoughtful engagement with literature. Brooks' travel letters, essays, sent from James's native land and penned just before the outbreak of war, evoke a world that by then had vanished before recall. Just one sentence of conclusion. Henry James's art of criticism evolved from harsh reviews of his youth toward greater appreciation of selected individual authors, and then self-reflection, and then astute theorization of the novel, the genre into which he breathed a new life and freedom. Thank you very much for your attention.
Many thanks, Professor Mirosława, for your engaging talk, and then your contribution today makes me think of James's reviews on Balzac. He wrote five criticism texts about Balzac, and then I'm thinking of how his reviews do exactly this, that you're saying, that his reviews charge his intellectual and artistic thought. And because in his early reviews of Balzac, for example, he mentions a sense of time that is mostly linear. He mentions the overmastering sense of the present. And then when we check his fiction of that same moment, we can see that the representation of time is accordingly more linear. But then in his later reviews of Balzac, when he sees the more intricate pattern of Balzac's time, James is producing the Golden Bowl. Mm-hmm. So that's exactly what you are teaching us, that his critical reviews reflect his artistic development as well.
Yeah, and see how he criticizes reviewing in this final text on the text I mentioned, the prospects of American, the question of opportunities for American literature, the need for reviews also. Mm-hmm. There's a flood of reviews and there's a need for them too. But he actually makes a distinction between rough and ready reviews, one book reviews, and more in-depth, appreciative literary criticism. Balzac is thank you so much, Natasha, for this remark. It's absolutely fascinating how useful Balzac was to Henry James, right? In many ways. Balzac, we should not forget that Balzac was an extremely prolific writer, right? He turned out over 90 novels. It's just James published 20 novels, and that's a lot, and many of them quite massive. But Balzac was probably, the lesson of Balzac, the title itself of this essay points out that he was a like teacher, perhaps not a master, but a teacher to Henry James, someone who was guiding his steps. James was appreciative, but he was also critical. He knew what Balzac did wrong. Balzac was writing because he was constantly in need of funding. He was constantly penniless. So writing was like it was an obsession, but writing was a necessity. And we heard from Professor Brooks that James was constantly worried about money. Probably he didn't have as many reasons for that as Balzac, but there was this pressure on Balzac to write constantly and produce, but also to produce a large panorama. And I think that James was also trying to do that, and not just to write novels that show a little bit of this milieu and different environment, but to show it a large panorama. It was of course, more of a challenge for Henry James because of his transatlantic involvement, right? Because he was trying to portray two countries, and whenever he could portrayed one, the other was offended, or the other way. The Prince Casamassima and the Bostonians are an excellent example, right? The Bostonians loved in London and hated in America. The Prince Casamassima, the other way around, right? Because the setting was different. So it was more of a challenge for Henry James, and Henry James is definitely more of an experimenter than Balzac. I would say, but still, a genius can learn from someone who is a craftsman, like Balzac. I would say Balzac was a craftsman. James also thought of himself as a craftsman in a way, but he was at heart an experimenter, and this is what I love about his fiction.
Thank you so much for your comment. We have one question specifically about this transnational aspect of James's fiction. I have here some comments from YouTube. I will show them here. We have the first one from Geraldo Cáfaro. He says, "Thank you for this wonderful and enlightening presentation. Would you say James resented Dickens' popularity, hence the unfavorable reviews he wrote of him? When did education end and self-affirmation begin?"
I don't know. Perhaps there was some. First of all, thank you so much. And I think our paths crossed in the past, and I hope they do cross again, Professor Cáfaro. To answer your question, well, first of all, thank you for the question, for the remark. Yes, he may have been resentful, but he also, the thing is that Charles Dickens was the kind of novelist who was also a journalist, first and foremost, from my perspective, very much involved in social issues, political issues, which was not part of Henry James's profile. So I think there was some discrepancy there. And I think James was very honest in denouncing the hackneyed quality of Charles Dickens's fiction in later years. There's this lovely story of Henry James as a little boy who listened to someone reading aloud to the family and members a story of one of the novels of Charles Dickens, and he was supposed to go to bed, little Harry, but he didn't. He hid under the table, and he listened to that novel, and all of a sudden the family became aware of his presence because he started sobbing. Right, so he was deeply moved as a child by Dickens's novels, and also he attended. I think Dickens was an extremely, as you rightly point out, Dickens was an extremely popular author, and some of his novels were turned into plays, which was staged in New York. And as far as I know, he attended such performances and was again moved. But then this early taste changed, and he desired something else, something that was not so sentimental, so weepy, something that would go beyond those hackneyed social concerns. So it's very difficult to say when and where appreciation stops and self-education it begins, because I think James couldn't have pointed well, perhaps he could have pointed such a moment, but for his biographers, I think it's very difficult to say when exactly he ceased to appreciate Dickens. I think he both appreciated him, Dickens, and felt that he was not his author after all. Well, James, in the 1880s, James tried his hand at social novel. The Bostonians, Brisca Massima, and he, of course, he did his best. He did research and he wrote those books as best he could, but they were obviously not appreciated. But because no one expected him to be a social novelist. There is this tradition to label authors, and I think James resented that as well, because he wanted to experiment with different forms that were appealing to contemporary audiences. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We have one more comment here, and then let me show that to you. Here from Thais Soranzo. Thank you for such an insightful talk, Professor Buchholtz. How do you think James's essays on painting, published in the periodical press, were related to his literary reviews?
Thank you so much, Thais Soranzo. Yes, we all know that his literary art is very visual, and his education, self-education in museums during his travels, taught him to be a very appreciative art critic, and critic not only of visual arts but also architecture. In his route tour in France, he also comments on the art of architecture. Yes, absolutely. I think there's a close relation. I haven't studied his essays on painting in great detail, I'm afraid, and I said, well, I bracket that out because that's a huge field in itself, but it's definitely worth studying, and it's definitely related to his fiction. Yesterday, Professor Paul Armstrong had a lovely, wonderful lecture, which also included references to the famous painting of Lambinet and how it matters in the novel, in the Ambassadors. So there is a connection, definitely, and yes. Some more work and research would need to be done. Thank you very much. Yes, this is a very good point.
Thank you. Yesterday with Professor Paul Armstrong, Thais mentioned they talked about the Lambinet painting during his presentation yesterday. We have another question here from Larissa Neves. In your article, Time and Transformation in Henry James's Social Novels, you argue that James is deeply engaged with history, capturing the nuances of American and British societies. Yet, at the same time, as you note in the introduction to Henry James's travel, fiction, and nonfiction, his work transcends temporal and national boundaries by addressing transnational themes. Mm-hmm. And do you think that this double dimension, history and timelessness, or geography and transnationality, is also present in his reviews?
Larissa Neves, thank you so much. This is such a wonderful question. And thank you for reading that essay that I published recently, and that introduction that is, I think, yeah, 6 years ago. You're absolutely right. And this is the fascination of Henry James, that he writes about history that also has this quality of timelessness. And I really think that in writing about Bostonians, he coded messages about England, and vice versa, because comparable phenomena, feminism and anarchism, were developing on both sides of the Atlantic. So actually, the audience, it went over the audience's head. I mean, much of James, it's such a wonderful thing that James has appreciative and insightful and careful readers today in Brazil. Uh, because his contemporary audience did not see those nuances. Like, well, they thought, okay, he's writing about London, and here he's writing about Boston, but actually, you could turn those locations and say, well, comparable things, perhaps not exactly the same, but comparable. So yes, I think that there is double and triple dimension to James's fiction, and actually, this makes our job easy in the sense that whatever we say is correct, right? um, so it seems to me, right? You can stand actually any claim about Henry James because he is such a well, to me, I've been thinking about Henry James and how should I define him? I think Ezra Pound thought he was like a continent. I think of Henry James as an institution. And that's recent. That's recent. That's something that occurred to me quite recently. A literary institution, really. When I started researching his also his literary criticism, that's what appeared to me. History and timeless. Wonderful, a wonderful approach. Thank you. Thanks very much.
That's so wonderful. I really like it. Like thinking of James as an institution. I'll
Yeah,
follow your tip. That's great. I really like it. Professor, we have two more questions. Do you have time?
of course.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Good
Okay.
company. If you have good company, you enjoy.
Okay. So here, from Núcleo de Estudos Henry James, which is our research center. Professor Buchholtz, thank you very much for such an enlightening conference. In your talk, you mentioned that as James grew older and more experienced, he shifted toward a more subjective mode of reviewing. In my opinion, this is not only one of the most distinctive aspects of his critical work, but also perhaps its greatest strength. Could you please elaborate a bit more on this shift?
To more subjective. Right. Yeah. As a young reviewer, he was just tearing those books to pieces, disparaging them, and then as he also became a serious published author and criticized author, which is sometimes helpful to be a criticized author, he became more concerned about his own stakes in criticism and in reviewing. And I think of prefaces as a good example of this self-reflexive mode of critical work. Um, um, yes, he is becoming inward, less interested. Well, of course, interested in what's going on around him, but also interested in how his own consciousness processes what he sees around him. Um, um, it is strong. Yeah, it is. It is it is one of the strengths of his late writing. But I'd like to go back to the preface to Rupert Brooks's book, which was a surprise to me. It was published in 1916, the year of James's death, and it's a eulogy. It's a eulogy of a young poet. Of course, it's this kind of it's this convoluted late Jamesian style, but it's, I think, too sweet and too kind. James keeps surprising you. At the end of his career, he can be so write a panegyric. Michael Gora probably didn't think of this preface to Rupert Brooke's book, because he would have to admit that there is a panegyric. But then Rupert Brooke had a special status among those writers of the day. He died a soldier's death, and James wanted to pay tribute to him. And also, we shouldn't forget, Rupert Brooke was an exceptionally handsome young man, and that's what any account of his life, this poet's life, includes. That he was a very handsome man, exceptionally handsome young man, much younger than Henry James. So this preface is a tribute to Brooke as a soldier, as a poet, and then also an example of James's admiration for beautiful young men. And I was thinking, because the book is entitled Letters from America, and I was thinking, what a wonderful thing. What a wonderful story to compare American Scene with Letters from America by Rupert Brooke. But it's not that promising at all, because Rupert Brooke's Letters from America are letters from more from Canada than from the United States, and then from Samoa. So you have only 2 or 3 chapters on New York, and then Boston, Harvard, Boston, Cambridge, and then Canada. So not quite comparable. And where James is deep and often critical of his native land, Rupert Brooke is a typical tourist who appreciates this aspect and is a little bit critical, but mostly he is appreciative of the United States. So I don't know if I answered your question, but this is a wonderful question. This is a research question, actually. So yeah.
Sure. Thank you, Professor.
Thanks.
We have one more question here by Luisa Mello. Thank you, Professor, for your excellent lecture. I found your argument that his work as a literary critic is part of James's apprenticeship, a kind of literary building. Can you see a parallel evolution between his literary criticism and his fiction?
Thank you very much, Professor Luisa Mello. Parallel between his literary criticism and his fiction. Yeah, it's all of a piece. His literary criticism serves his fiction from the very beginning to the very end. And his fiction also plays a major role in the standards he sets in his literary criticism. As his artistic program solidifies, he knows what he appreciates in other people's works and what he doesn't. But he puts it very gently and in such a delicate manner that even if someone is criticized, they do not really notice it, because he is he's so kind, so eloquent in voicing his criticism. The evolution of his fiction. Well, I said before that what I like about Henry James is his experimentation. Bazard may have been his model to some extent in his productivity. Hawthorne definitely wasn't. One of the things that he points out about Hawthorne is that he was not productive enough. And James wanted to be a professional author, and being a professional author means producing, publishing constantly, a lot of books, valuable books, good books. James was an experimenter, and I think his evolution, the evolution of his fiction was often a revolution, because he He was trying his hand at different genres. Not interestingly enough, no poetry. There's no poetry, but drama and short fiction, and then the novel. He found that the novel was really his own best preferable genre. So I would say that his evolution was at times a revolution of his fiction. I would see both evolution and revolution every now and then, because he was trying different topics. And in those social novels, he was as close to nationalism as he could be. Um, and the interesting story of those meetings with nationalists and circle around Zola and Flaubert was that he actually met them in the 1870s in Paris. And interestingly enough, he was not yet a famous author. So those French authors didn't really notice him. He participated in their conversations. He was not quite enthusiastic about what they were doing. They were too carnal for him. But then when he returned to Paris in the 1880s, and by then he was a celebrated American author, all of a sudden they realized, all right, we know this guy. We met him before. We didn't even notice him. So yeah, he even tried his hand at nationalism, and apparently that didn't go down well, because Henry James was just pigeonholed as a novelist of upper social classes, and he was not expected to be the kind of experimenter that he was. Thank you so much for this question, for your comment.
Great, thank you, Professor. I have one more question, because it's a follow-up to what you have just commented. In the introduction to Henry James's travel fiction and non-fiction, you described James's travel writing as a fluid genre, one that may have served as a stepping stone to his fiction. And then you cite The Madonna of the Future as a compelling example of this hybridity, like being both a vivid tour of Florence and the narrative about artists in Italy. So you see a similar kind of fluidity of narrative complexity in his critical reviews?
Thank you so much for this question. This is absolutely true. I agree. I couldn't agree more with this. There's you really hard put. That's why I began with referring to generic fluidity of Daisy Miller and The Turn of the Screw, which is sometimes classified as novels. What are they? Tales, novellas, novels? Who knows? And yes, this generic fluidity, I think, applies to much of Henry James's fiction, with the exception of those big novels, which we call novels, and that's it. But those shorter pieces, especially his literary criticism, that he really is not bound by any prescriptions and rules. Whatever he thinks is right, he writes, and that's it. He's not worried about how it's going to be classified. But of course, literary critics like to classify and like to say, this is a review, this is literary criticism. Actually, you're absolutely right. And this is an excellent conclusion to our discussion, our conversation. Yes, this is what I mean. Yes, I agree.
Thank you, Professor. Those were all the questions that we have for you. Thank you hugely for your contribution to our conference. I also thank the audience for being here with us, and I would like to invite you all to our next activity, which will be an online roundtable that will happen at 4 p.m. And then it will be streamed live here in the NEJ YouTube channel. So stay tuned to our next activity. And thank you so much, Mirosława, for your talk.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.